Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere cold, dark, and just a little unsettling. Imagine the Carpathian Mountains, rising like jagged teeth against a bruised sky. Their peaks tipped with snow, and forests thick enough to swallow entire armies. You hear the crunch of frozen soil under your boots, the whisper of branches overhead, and in the distance, the low moan of wolves. Welcome to late 16th century Hungary, the land of castles that never quite sleep, of peasants who cling to prayers like armor, and of nobles whose family feuds make modern soap operas look tame. And tonight, you're about to meet a young girl who will one day become the most infamous woman in European history, Erzsébet Báthory. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you were one of her servants. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's listening from where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air around you smells of pine smoke and damp earth, the familiar perfume of survival in a land where winters are merciless and summers carry the ever-present threat of plague. Hungary in the late 1500s isn't exactly the friendliest of places. The kingdom is split between three powers: the Habsburg monarchs in the west, the Ottoman Empire pressing from the south and east, and a fragment of semi-independent Transylvania in the middle. It's a patchwork quilt of allegiances, betrayals, and battlefields. And it's right here, between the crumbling fortresses and border skirmishes, that Erzsébet Báthory is born in 1560. Her family, the Bathory clan, is one of those dynasties so entangled in Europe's royal bloodlines that if you shake the family tree, about 6 crowns and 2 coronets fall out. They control swathes of land, command soldiers, and occasionally dabble in the kind of court politics that can get you poisoned at dinner. For Erzsébet, this means a childhood saturated with privilege, but also with danger. You don't get to be that rich and that powerful without painting a target on your velvet sleeves. Picture it. You're trudging into a drafty hall, torches flickering against stone walls, and the sound of armored boots echoing off the floor. The banners overhead show the Bathory dragon crest, blood red on a golden background, a not-so-subtle reminder that this family is both rich and terrifying. Servants move like shadows, always aware of their place, always cautious of the sharp eyes watching from the high table. As Erzsébet toddles through these halls, she is already absorbing the lesson that power isn't something you inherit. It's something you defend. Mainstream historical fact. Here's one. Hungary in her youth was still reeling from the Battle of Mohács in 1526, when the Ottomans crushed the Hungarian army and split the kingdom apart. The aftershocks of that disaster ripple through Erzsébet's world, shaping a land where alliances are fragile and violence is routine. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some accounts say Erzsébet suffered from epileptic seizures as a child, and the treatment back then was, well, medieval. Blood from a non-sufferer, often rubbed on the lips of the patient, was thought to cure the fits. Imagine being 6 years old and someone saying, "Hold still while we smear this fresh chicken blood on you." It's good medicine. Comforting, right? You can almost hear her tiny voice saying, can I just have soup instead? But historians still argue whether these stories of epilepsy are based on real records or later inventions designed to explain her supposed fascination with blood. Was it genuine childhood illness or retroactive gossip to make her adult legend even creepier? The Carpathian landscape itself feels like a character in her story. It's both beautiful and menacing. Deep valleys where mists curl like sleeping spirits, and jagged ridges where castles cling as though afraid of sliding into oblivion. The peasants here tell tales of witches in the woods, curses that ride on the wind, and wolves that can smell sin. For a child like Erzsébet, raised in privilege but surrounded by this folklore, reality and superstition blend like ink spilled into water. You find yourself at the edge of a village. Huts made of timber and mud crouch against the cold, their thatched roofs sagging under snow. Inside, families huddle together, trading stories of the noble lady who lives up at Chait Castle. Some say she's beautiful, others whisper she has the devil's temper. No one dares speak too loudly, because in this world, nobles aren't just landlords, they're fate itself. And so, Erzsébet grows up in a country defined by sharp contrasts, opulent feasts in candlelit halls versus starving peasants gnawing bark in famine years, marble floors that echo with lute music just miles away from muddy battlefields soaked with Ottoman arrows. You can almost sense her absorbing these extremes, like a sponge, soaking up both wine and blood. As you settle deeper into this night's story, remember, the shadows over the Carpathians don't just belong to wolves and bandits. They belong to human ambition, cruelty, and paranoia. And right now, a young girl named Erzsébet is learning how to move in those shadows, how to wield them, and maybe, one day, how to be swallowed by them. You trudge further into the Carpathian foothills, the mist curling around your ankles like ghostly fingers, and you can almost feel the weight of history pressing down on you. Erzsébet Báthory isn't just any child wandering these valleys. She is the scion of a family whose name carries both reverence and dread. The Báthorys are the kind of dynasty that can summon soldiers with a gesture, arrange marriages like chess moves, and embroil entire regions in scandal without ever leaving their castles. You, standing here, are just a shadow passing through lands ruled by power so old it smells faintly of candle wax, dust, and leather-bound ledgers. Born in 1560 at near Báthory, a modest fortress compared to the later Shajdeh, Erzsébet is the product of a union between Baron George Bathory and Anna Bathory, cousins within the extended family tree, a common practice among nobility, designed to keep land and influence tightly in the family circle. Imagine family gatherings where everyone is related in 2 or 3 ways, and the conversation occasionally slips into debates about which estates are rightfully whose. Here, loyalty is less about friendship and more about blood, and betrayal smells like money. The Bathory name already has notorious echoes by the time she is born. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, will become Prince of Transylvania and later King of Poland. Another relative, Countess Bathory, will stir religious tensions with the Protestant Reformation. Power isn't just inherited, it's performed, displayed, and defended. Erzsébet is learning the rules of this theater before she can even read properly. Mainstream fact: the Bathory family is among the richest in Central Europe. Their estates cover hundreds of villages, forests, and mines. Imagine the scale of influence. She could command armies, dictate trade, and decide the fates of people who would otherwise never appear on her radar. In short, Erzsébet grows up knowing that she belongs to the upper echelon of power, where even the wind seems to bow. Quirky tidbit: the Bathorys had a peculiar obsession with hygiene for the era. They reportedly bathed more frequently than typical Hungarian nobles, believing that water could prevent disease and even influence fortune. This makes the later stories of Erzsébet bathing in blood all the more ironic. A family already preoccupied with cleanliness turning into folklore about ritualistic bathing. You can almost picture a young Erzsébet splashing in a proper wooden tub, being told that a spotless body reflects a spotless mind, not knowing how her name will twist centuries later. Historians still argue whether these stories of the family's peculiar hygiene practices and their obsession with the youth were exaggerated to set the stage for the bloodbath legends. Was it a harmless aristocratic quirk, or did it feed into rumors that later painted Erzsébet as unnatural and cruel? The family's wealth also comes with political connections that serve as invisible strings, tugging at Erzsébet's life. She's related to both Catholic and Protestant factions, giving her family leverage, but also attracting enemies on multiple fronts. Imagine being 10 years old and overhearing that distant relatives have been exiled, imprisoned, or even assassinated for merely choosing the wrong side in a religious dispute. That's childhood in the Bathory household. Lessons in survival are interwoven with lessons in power. And it's not just politics. There's the culture of fear. Servants are strictly monitored, with punishments administered swiftly and visibly, if only to remind everyone where the line between obedience and disaster lies. Noble children grow up internalizing this, learning that power is inseparable from intimidation. Erzsébet sees and absorbs all of it. You can practically feel her shadow trailing along the hallways, eyes wide, memorizing which gestures earn respect and which invite disaster. By her early years, Erzsébet is also exposed to education uncommon for girls at the time. She learns languages, household management, basic mathematics for overseeing estates, and etiquette suitable for interactions with kings and princes. Imagine practicing Latin grammar while the cold wind rattles the shutters and the cook mutters curses about burned bread. This duality, rigorous learning, and constant exposure to human frailty is forming a mind that will later navigate both the splendor and terror of aristocratic life. Quirky tidbit number 2. The Bathorys reportedly kept a collection of exotic animals, including falcons, hunting dogs, and even a few wild beasts captured from the surrounding forests. Young Erzsébet would have seen these creatures as symbols of both control and danger, understanding instinctively that to command life is to command fear. Perhaps this was her first real lesson in balancing beauty, dominance, and menace, a triad that will echo in her later legend. Historians still argue whether Erzsébet's upbringing among such extremes, affluence, education, and fear, predisposed her to cruelty, or whether later chroniclers simply amplified normal aristocratic harshness into monstrous legends. Was she shaped by environment, or was the narrative constructed long after her death? You feel the tension in the air, as if these questions are whispers from the castle walls themselves, waiting to see if anyone listening tonight will side with history or myth. By adolescence, her world is a tightly controlled bubble. Grand feasts in candlelit halls, lessons with tutors who speak in Latin and German, and walks through estate grounds where laborers work tirelessly under the Bathory gaze. She observes her parents' authority, noting which gestures command loyalty and which invite defiance. And all the while, rumors of distant wars, Ottoman raids, and family feuds simmer like a slow boil in the background. For a girl of 10 or 12, understanding the subtleties of power is not optional, it's survival. And so, you can feel the tension tightening around her. This is a child born into excess, into fear, and into opportunity. The Carpathian winds that brush her cheeks carry whispers of both greatness and doom. In this land of castles and shadowed forests, Erzsébet Báthory's bloodline doesn't just grant her privilege, it marks her for legend. And whether that legend will become a story of horror or political intrigue is a question that not even time has fully settled. You follow the winding mountain path, and the air grows sharper, almost electric, as though the very cliffs are whispering secrets of ambition and obligation. Erzsébet Báthory is no longer a child watching shadows in castle corridors. She is stepping into a world where every handshake, every smile, every bow carries the weight of politics. By her early teens, marriage is no longer an abstract concept. It's a strategic move dictated by her family, a transaction in the grand chess game of Central European nobility. And the man she's promised to? Ferenc Nadasdy, a figure whose name already carries whispers of both charm and darkness. A black knight who will become her husband and perhaps her mirror in ambition and cruelty. At the time, political marriages among the aristocracy are rarely about romance. They are contracts designed to consolidate land, secure military alliances, and protect family interests. Erzsébet's parents orchestrate her union to strengthen the Bathory influence in Western Hungary and cement ties with the Nadasdy family. Imagine sitting at a polished oak table, listening to your father outline the strategic merits of a marriage, while a child's small hand clutches a silver goblet, tasting neither wine nor freedom. Mainstream historical fact: Erzsébet and Ferenc are officially betrothed when she is just 14, with a formal marriage ceremony taking place a few years later. Ferenc Nadasdy is significantly older, already known for his military exploits against the Ottomans, and his fierce reputation in Hungarian politics. For Erzsébet, this means entering a marriage where her role is both partnership and political instrument. You can practically feel the cold calculation, the invisible ledger of favors and debts hovering above the ceremony. Quirky tidbit: Ferenc has a peculiar habit of carrying a small falcon with him, even during military campaigns, believing the bird brings luck in battle. Imagine young Erzsébet learning the ways of the household, noticing that her future husband talks to a bird more than to the servants. And somehow, this becomes part of the courtly dance of power and superstition. Historians still argue whether Erzsébet's later behavior, her alleged cruelty and obsession with youth, was influenced by the psychological impact of such an early, politically motivated marriage. Did growing up in a world where affection is conditional and power is a transaction shape her character? Or is that reading modern psychology into a rigid historical context? Once married, Erzsébet moves into Nadasdy estates, a transition that is more than physical. She must navigate unfamiliar hierarchies of servants, vassals, and local nobility while learning to manage vast properties. In this environment, authority is both expected and scrutinized. Any misstep could be exploited by rivals eager to weaken the Bathory-Nadasdy alliance. You can almost hear the whispered calculations behind closed doors. Does she know enough to keep this estate running? Can she survive here without scandal? Ferenc, on the other hand, is largely absent, frequently called to the front lines against Ottoman incursions. While some might think this is a relief for Erzsébet, it instead trusts enormous responsibility on her young shoulders. Running estates in a politically volatile region involves collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes, and managing laborers who often resent being overseen by a teenage girl. Imagine tallying the accounts, riding out to inspect fields, negotiating with nobles twice your age, all while learning to maintain the delicate balance of fear and respect. Quirky tidbit number 2. Wedding celebrations in Hungarian noble circles are extravagant affairs. The Bathory-Nadasdy union reportedly included a procession of hundreds of guests, musicians, and exotic animals. One account mentions a live bear being paraded through the courtyard to entertain visitors. You can picture young Erzsébet, a mixture of awe and terror in her eyes, seeing the chaos and the spectacle, perhaps noting which guests bowed correctly and which laughed too loudly. Yet, despite the splendor, danger is never far. Hungary is a borderland, and the Nadasdy estates are strategically located near Ottoman-controlled territory. Bandits, raids, and feuding nobles mean that daily life, even celebrations, is underscored by tension. Servants move with caution. Soldiers patrol constantly. And the air carries the scent of both feasts and smoke from nearby skirmishes. Erzsébet is learning that privilege is inseparable from vigilance. Every jewel and every silk gown is shadowed by risk. Historians still argue how much Ferenc's prolonged absences shaped Erzsébet's later actions. Some suggest that managing estates alone taught her independence and decisiveness, qualities later twisted into the narrative of cruelty. Others argue that a combination of isolation, teenage responsibility, and pressure from servants and rivals created an environment ripe for legend-making. Through all this, Erzsébet's personal education continues in parallel with her political training. Tutors teach languages, estate management, and court etiquette. She learns to read Latin documents, oversee transactions, and negotiate disputes with the same cool efficiency her father displayed. You can almost hear her silently taking mental notes, cataloging who is loyal, who fears her, and who might one day betray her. This is a girl learning power by observation. And like all great observers, she records the small cues, the way someone shifts their weight, the hesitation in a bow, the glint of greed in a servant's eye. As night falls over the castle and the sounds of distant hunting horns fade into the darkness, you can feel the pressure settling around Erzsébet like a cloak. Her marriage is not a love story. It is a contract with high stakes, a training ground for authority, and a crucible for character. In the quiet hours, she moves through candlelit halls, aware that every glance and every whisper could one day be used against her, or perhaps by her. And you realize, following her journey this far, that power and fear are inseparable companions, shaping a young woman who will soon become both legendary and infamous. You trudge through the dense forests of northern Hungary, and the wind shifts, carrying the cold, metallic scent of stone and iron. Up ahead, Szeged Castle rises from the cliffs like a jagged crown, its towers silhouetted against a fading sky. It isn't just a home, it's a fortress, a symbol of dominance, and a world unto itself. Here, Erzsébet Báthory settles into her adult life, and it's easy to see how the castle, with its labyrinthine halls and echoing chambers, could shape the stories that follow. The stone walls are thick, the corridors dim, and even the sunlight filtering through narrow windows seems cautious, like it's aware of the secrets hidden within. Szeged Castle sits perched strategically on a hill, commanding the surrounding valleys. From a distance, it's picturesque, with wooded slopes and a small river shredding past its base. But up close, the air is heavier, tinged with smoke from kitchens and stables, mixed with the odors of damp stone and livestock. The castle is more than a residence. It's a fortress built to withstand sieges. And that militarized environment creates both a sense of security and a sense of isolation. You feel how easy it would be for rumors, gossip, and legends to take root in a place where walls can keep you safe, but also trap you with your fears. Mainstream historical fact: Erzsébet Báthory moves permanently to Szeged with her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, in the 1570s. The castle's defensive features, towers, thick walls, and a surrounding moat, reflect the era's constant threat of Ottoman incursions and regional conflicts. Life in such a fortress demands vigilance. Servants patrol corridors, guards monitor the gates, and even the children learn that walls are both protector and prison. Quirky tidbit: the castle reportedly had secret passageways and hidden rooms where the family could retreat or hide valuables from raiders. Some stories even claim there were ghost corridors designed to confuse intruders. Imagine young Erzsébet wandering these hidden spaces, candle in hand, imagining echoes of footsteps that aren't hers. It's the perfect setting for both political intrigue and, later, sensationalized tales of horror. Historians still argue whether the castle's design contributed to the darker legends surrounding Bathory. Did its labyrinthine layout provide cover for crimes that never happened? Or did it genuinely facilitate misconduct? The walls themselves may be complicit in the myths. Inside, daily life is a complex dance of hierarchy and ritual. The castle houses dozens of servants, soldiers, and administrators. Each has a role, each movement observed and evaluated. Food is prepared in massive kitchens, laundry churns in basins, and the corridors echo with instructions shouted from one level to the next. Erzsébet, as the lady of the house, presides over this microcosm of authority. You can almost feel her pacing the halls, noting who is competent, who fears her, and who is clever enough to navigate both obedience and ambition. And yet, isolation is ever present. Even in the largest of rooms, the shadows cling to corners, whispering. The forests outside are filled with dangers. Bandits, wolves, and political rivals lurking in the hills. Inside the castle, servants might spread rumors or exaggerate small events, which, in a place where isolation amplifies every sound, can grow into frightening tales overnight. Erzsébet is learning, in real time, the power of perception and the ease with which reality can be distorted. Quirky tidbit number 2. It's said that some castle chambers had specially designed stone sinks where rainwater could be collected and used during sieges. You can almost see young Erzsébet watching the water drip, calculating how every resource must be managed. A small lesson in logistics that her tutors and later her own management of the estates will reinforce. Life in the castle is also punctuated by the rituals of nobility. Feasts are elaborate, with meats roasted on spits and spiced wines poured into silver goblets. Entertainment ranges from minstrels to falconry displays, all under the watchful gaze of the Bathory crest hanging above the great hall. You can almost hear the tension under the music and laughter, the unspoken rule that one misstep could become gossip, and gossip could become political ammunition. Historians still argue whether Erzsébet's behaviors, later described as cruelty, were facilitated by the environment of Chejte. Did the castle's isolation allow the exaggeration of minor disciplinary actions into monstrous legends? Or did its remote power genuinely enable misconduct that would have been impossible elsewhere? As night falls, the castle transforms. Corridors grow colder, shadows lengthen, and the wind whistles through battlements, sounding eerily like distant voices. Servants move quickly, lanterns swinging, while outside, the forest seems to press against the walls. In this environment, Erzsébet's understanding of control, fear, and authority deepens. She observes, records, and adapts, learning the delicate balance between command and menace. And as the candles flicker, you can almost sense the castle itself conspiring with legend, turning every story whispered in its halls into fodder for history or myth. You trudge deeper into the labyrinth of Erzsébet's early life, and the air seems to carry a mix of herbs, smoke, and whispered incantations. In these hills and valleys, the line between medicine and magic is not so much blurred as it is non-existent. Folk healers, midwives, and cunning women are as common as blacksmiths and merchants. Their knowledge a patchwork of observation, superstition, and trial and error. If you were a child wandering through this world, you would quickly learn that a scraped knee might be treated with a poultice one day, a whispered charm the next, and that the difference between life and death could be nothing more than which healer you happen to meet. Erzsébet grows up absorbing these lessons, watching as her household servants consult apothecaries, herbalists, and occasionally the more eccentric practitioners who claim to communicate with spirits. Some herbs are genuinely effective: willow bark for pain, sage for infection. But many remedies rely on ritual and symbolism. A broken arm might be bound with a strip of cloth blessed by a midwife, or a fever treated with a small charm pinned to the clothing. You can almost hear the chanting, the scraping of mortar, the faint metallic scent of powdered minerals mixed into oils. Mainstream historical fact: Hungary and Transylvania during the 16th century rely heavily on folk medicine because formal medical schools are limited and physicians are expensive. Nobles like Erzsébet have access to tutors who provide some formal education in anatomy and remedies, but even they often defer to traditional treatments. Medicine is practical, but it's also performative. Appearance can matter as much as effect. Quirky tidbit: some accounts suggest that Erzsébet's family employed a healer who recommended that the young girl wash in wine or herb-infused water to ward off illness. You can imagine a teenage Erzsébet, half annoyed, half fascinated, standing in a wooden tub as fragrant liquids drip down her arms while a healer mutters in Latin. It's part ritual, part hygiene, part superstition, and entirely formative. Historians still argue whether these early exposures to folk remedies and ritual practices influenced later stories of Erzsébet bathing in blood. Was she fascinated by unconventional treatments? Or were chroniclers retrofitting common medicinal rituals into grotesque legends? The culture of magic and superstition isn't limited to illness. Love charms, curses, and talismans abound. In a household the size of the Bathory dynasty estates, it's easy for rumor to mingle with ritual. Servants might attribute a sudden recovery to a whispered spell rather than a natural turn of events, while small injuries or illnesses can be mythologized in ways that exaggerate their significance. Erzsébet observes all of this, learning early that perception can carry as much weight as reality, especially when combined with fear and awe. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some midwives in the region were known to use small amounts of what we would now recognize as hallucinogenic plants to ease pain during childbirth. The effects were sometimes dramatic: visions, fainting, or unusual behavior that, when reported, could easily be interpreted as magic or supernatural influence. You can almost picture a young Erzsébet watching these intense reactions with a mixture of curiosity and quiet calculation. In addition to folk medicine, Erzsébet's tutors likely introduced her to a more formal understanding of the human body. Anatomy books circulated among the nobility, filled with illustrations of organs, blood vessels, and the skeletal system. You can imagine her flipping through pages, noticing the blood coursing through the human form, perhaps unconsciously setting the stage for the later legends of her obsession with youth and vitality. The line between studying life and tampering with it is subtle, and in Erzsébet's mind, observation and control are intimately connected. Historians still argue whether the Bathory fascination with remedies, youth, and beauty, whether herbal, ritualistic, or alchemical, was genuinely medical, or whether it was exaggerated into tales of horror. Were these common aristocratic experiments, or were they deliberately sensationalized by rivals and pamphleteers? And the environment reinforces the mystique. The forests and mountains are filled with plants considered magical or medicinal. A walk in the woods might involve collecting herbs, encountering a wandering healer, or overhearing whispered superstitions from villagers. Erzsébet grows up in a world where knowledge, power, and fear intermingle. She internalizes lessons about authority and influence, understanding that control over health, life, and survival can translate into social leverage. By adolescence, this fusion of medicine, magic, and superstition has shaped her perception of the world. She sees cause and effect, ritual and result, observation and intervention. She notices that people fear what they don't understand and respect what seems powerful, even if it is mundane. And in the quiet of candlelit rooms, where oils simmer and herbs hang from rafters, Erzsébet begins to form an intuition that knowledge, perception, and fear are tools, and that wielding them effectively requires patience, cunning, and sometimes a touch of theatrics. You trudge through the corridors of Cheshire Castle, the torches flickering on cold stone, and you can almost feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on Erzsébet. Ferenc Nadasdy, her husband, is away much of the time, riding off to battle the Ottomans, leaving her in charge of vast estates that stretch across Hungary. Suddenly, the young noblewoman is no longer merely an observer of power. She is wielding it. Taxes, labor disputes, and the management of dozens of villages now rest on her shoulders. You can almost hear the clatter of ledgers being opened, quills scratching over ink, and the quiet hum of servants moving with a mixture of fear and obedience. Mainstream historical fact. During Ferenc's military campaigns, Erzsébet effectively governs the family estates, overseeing administration, finances, and the day-to-day running of the households. She commands soldiers, supervises laborers, and mediates disputes among villagers, essentially acting as the de facto lord of the land. For a young woman in 16th century Hungary, this is extraordinary. You can almost feel the tension in every decision. One misstep could bring ruin to her family's reputation, or spark rebellion among those she governs. Quirky tidbit: Erzsébet reportedly had a fascination with hunting falcons, sometimes accompanying the estate's falconers to check on birds and supervise training. While this might seem like a hobby, it also functioned as a subtle demonstration of authority. She was overseeing the precision and discipline of the hunt, a microcosm of the control she exercised over her human subjects. Imagine a teenage Erzsébet, cloak billowing, her sharp gaze evaluating both bird and handler alike. Historians still argue whether her strong-handed management of estates was typical for women of her class, or whether it contributed to the perception of her as unusually harsh. Was she merely efficient, or did contemporaries exaggerate her severity, especially in political narratives after her death? Running estates in this era is not just about collecting rents. You navigate feudal obligations, ensure crop yields, manage forest resources, and maintain the loyalty of serfs, many of whom resent their overlords. Erzsébet learns quickly that fear can be an effective tool when wielded judiciously. A stern word, a public reprimand, or the threat of legal action can maintain order, but you sense that excessive cruelty risks turning respect into rebellion. She begins to calibrate her authority, understanding the delicate balance between governance and intimidation. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some records suggest that Erzsébet personally inspected the estates, riding on horseback through villages and forests, noting infractions and recording observations in her own hand. This hands-on approach is unusual for a noblewoman and contributes to her growing reputation for vigilance, and perhaps, later, for severity. You can picture her riding past cottages, servants ducking their heads, villagers murmuring, "The lady watches everything." In addition to administrative duties, Erzsébet oversees household management on an unprecedented scale. Kitchens, laundries, workshops, and stables all fall under her supervision. The castle operates like a small city, and she is the mayor, sheriff, and judge rolled into one. You can almost hear the rhythmic clanging of hammers, the hiss of ovens, and the whispered exchanges of servants who know their fate may hinge on pleasing her. Historians still argue whether Erzsébet's meticulous supervision of household and estate affairs was inherently oppressive, or whether later accounts sensationalized ordinary noble management into legendary cruelty. Could efficient administration be reframed as monstrous in the imagination of rivals and chroniclers? Ferencz's absence also leaves Erzsébet responsible for political negotiations with neighboring nobles, mediating disputes, and protecting the family's interests. She learns to navigate both diplomacy and intimidation, using her status to maintain alliances and neutralize potential threats. The ability to manage people, both friends and enemies, becomes a skill that will echo in the stories of her later life. The isolation of a young woman in command also shapes perception. Servants, soldiers, and villagers witness her decisiveness and authority, sometimes misunderstanding sternness for cruelty. The castle walls amplify rumor, and small events can spiral into legend. You can almost hear whispers behind tapestries. She rules with a firm hand, perhaps too firm. And from within her chambers, Erzsébet observes it all, learning that reputation can be as powerful as law. By the time she reaches her 20s, Erzsébet is a fully competent administrator and manager of estates, respected and feared in equal measure. She has learned the practicalities of governance, the psychology of fear, and the influence of appearance. Every decision, from rationing grain during winter shortages to settling disputes over land, teaches her about power and perception. And in the quiet moments, when the castle is still and the torches gutter low, you can sense that she is internalizing a crucial lesson. Authority is most potent when it is absolute. yet carefully measured. You step back and imagine yourself in her boots. The responsibility, the isolation, the constant vigilance. This is not just a tale of wealth or nobility. It's the story of a young woman navigating a world where her decisions ripple outward, touching lives in profound and sometimes frightening ways. Erzsébet Báthory is learning that leadership is a performance, one that requires courage, intelligence, and occasionally a touch of ruthlessness. You trudge through the shadowed corridors of Chejte Castle, and you can almost feel the tension in the air, like it's a living thing, coiling around your ankles. Erzsébet Báthory has been in command for several years now, running estates, overseeing villagers, and managing her household with a precision that would make any seasoned noble proud. But whispers begin to follow her like a second shadow. Are these rumors born of fear, envy, or reality? Early accusations start to trickle into court documents and letters, stories of harsh punishments, servants disciplined with extreme measures, and mysterious disappearances. You can practically hear the murmurs echoing through the halls. She's severe, some say, while others hesitate, eyes darting. Perhaps worse than that. Mainstream historical fact. Records indicate that Erzsébet maintained strict discipline over her servants and vassals, sometimes imposing severe punishments for theft, disobedience, or perceived slights. In a time and place where social hierarchies were rigid and punishments brutal by modern standards. Such behavior was not unusual for nobility, yet the tales take on a tone of something more sinister. You can almost picture her standing in a hall lined with trembling attendants, her voice carrying the authority of both law and lineage. Quirky tidbit: some contemporaneous accounts describe her inspecting servants for cleanliness and health with almost obsessive attention, checking fingernails, teeth, and even hair. While this may have been an effort at hygiene, noble houses often feared disease. It fed into rumors of an almost unnatural scrutiny of her staff. Imagine a young mistress walking quietly through the hallways, noting every detail of someone's appearance, while servants exchange anxious glances and silent prayers. Historians still argue whether these disciplinary measures were typical for a noblewoman asserting authority, or if they were exaggerated into tales of cruelty to serve political ends. Were these punishments necessary, or were they seeds sown for later sensationalized legends? The environment at Chejte amplifies perception. The castle is isolated, its thick walls containing not only servants, but also gossip, fear, and resentment. A minor reprimand can echo down corridors and over time blossom into a story of torment. In such a setting, perception can easily outweigh reality. One harsh word or correction might be remembered, exaggerated, and repeated until it becomes a cautionary tale. Quirky tidbit number 2. Reports suggest that Erzsébet sometimes tested servants with bizarre tasks, like measuring the speed of their work or assessing their reactions to small inconveniences, purely as a means to evaluate loyalty and competence. To modern eyes, this sounds almost experimental, like she was conducting social science before the term existed. You can picture her noting reactions, jotting observations in a ledger and refining her approach to household management with almost surgical precision. It's important to remember the broader social context. Hungarian nobles of the late 16th century often exercised near absolute authority over their estates. Peasants and servants lived under strict codes, and corporal punishment was common. You can almost hear the crack of a whip or the stern bark of a command. Everywhere, the lines between discipline and cruelty are blurry, especially when recounted decades later by those with motives to malign or embellish. Historians still argue how much of Erzsébet's reputed cruelty was reality versus rumor. Some suggest that her meticulous enforcement of rules, her insistence on hygiene, and her precise oversight of the estate may have been reframed by enemies as acts of sadism. Others contend that even by the standards of the time, her punishments were unusually harsh, hinting at an underlying temperament that may have contributed to later legends. Erzsébet's own psychology is also a matter of debate. She is a woman with immense power in a male-dominated society, learning early that respect must be commanded and fear can be a tool. Her observations of the world, her assessment of human behavior, and her management style all intertwine. Perhaps she is experimenting with authority, testing limits, and exploring the delicate balance between obedience and rebellion. You can almost sense the mental calculations as she walks through her halls, her mind cataloging each reaction, each hesitation, each flicker of emotion on a servant's face. And while you trudge through these corridors in imagination, the castle seems to pulse with whispers of both admiration and dread. Servants may obey, villagers may respect, but rumors begin to take on a life of their own. Each whispered story of harshness feeds into a growing mythology of Erzsébet Báthory as a woman capable of cruelty beyond reason. And you realize that in a place like Chejte, where isolation magnifies every act and imagination fills in every shadow, the line between discipline and sadism becomes almost impossible to measure. By the time Erzsébet reaches her late 20s, she is both respected and feared, navigating a tightrope between authority and legend. The practical necessity of discipline, the human tendency to embellish, and the isolation of castle life combine to create a narrative that will, over time, evolve into something far more sensational than the reality might have been. And as you listen, you can't help but wonder, in the shadows of these stone halls, where does duty end and cruelty begin? You trudge through the dense corridors of Chejte Castle once more, and something feels different in the air, heavier, as if the very stones remember stories long whispered and long feared. Erzsébet Báthory, now fully in her 30s, is no longer just a noblewoman managing estates. She has become the subject of tales that creep like fog through the valleys. The Blood Countess is whispered in villages miles away, her name carrying both fascination and terror. But how did these stories begin, and how much of them are grounded in reality? You can almost feel the legends pressing against the walls, eager to seep into every crack. Mainstream historical fact. By the early 1600s, rumors of Erzsébet torturing young women and bathing in their blood to maintain her youthful appearance begin circulating in Hungary and Transylvania. These tales gain momentum during political investigations into her family's affairs, particularly after her husband, Ferenc Nadasty's death in 1604. Blood becomes both metaphor and symbol, a way for contemporaries to explain alleged obsession with youth and beauty. Quirky tidbit. Some versions of the legend claim that Erzsébet preferred her victims to be virgins from peasant families, partly because she could avoid scandal among nobility, and partly because she believed their blood held magical restorative properties. Imagine the villagers' panic, whispering about the mysterious disappearances of girls who worked at nearby estates, their fear magnified by superstition and rumor. The combination of folklore, social anxiety, and elite privilege turns ordinary tragedies into tales of horror. Historians still argue whether the blood-bathing stories are based on fact, exaggeration, or deliberate slander. Some suggest political rivals and Protestant pamphleteers amplified tales of cruelty to discredit the Catholic Bathory family, while others argue that the sheer number of witnesses, though often inconsistent, implies at least partial truth. You feel the tension between myth and history, like a taut rope stretched across a dark chasm. The legend grows in part because of Erzsébet's isolation at Chete. The castle's thick walls, secret chambers, and labyrinthine corridors provide fertile ground for imagination. Servants' fears, villagers' gossip, and regional rivalries all contribute to a narrative that is part folklore, part political weapon. Imagine how a simple act of punishment or inspection, repeated over years, could evolve into a story of ritualistic blood bathing, especially when filtered through fear and superstition. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some retellings, it is claimed that Erzsébet kept detailed records of her servants and their supposed infractions, though no such diaries have survived. This alleged documentation feeds into the modern image of a calculating, methodical predator, even if the historical reality might have been more mundane. Meticulous estate management mistaken or intentionally portrayed as malevolent obsession. The cultural context is crucial. Central Europe at this time is steeped in legends of vampires, witches, and sorcery. Stories of young women disappearing or dying under mysterious circumstances are easily linked to the supernatural. You can almost hear the villagers' whispers. She walks in the moonlight, untouched by age, drawing life from the innocent. It's a narrative as compelling as it is terrifying, and the mountains themselves seem to echo the fear. Historians still argue about the role of pamphlets and testimonies in creating the Blood Countess myth. Many accounts emerge years after incidents supposedly occurred, written by scribes or enemies with motives ranging from moral outrage to political gain. Some modern scholars suggest that these stories were amplified to serve as cautionary tales against female authority, independence, or aristocratic excess. You can almost sense the ink drying on parchment, each word fanning the flames of legend. Yet, there is one persistent kernel of possibility. Deaths, disappearances, and severe punishments certainly occurred at Chejde. Whether these were acts of extraordinary cruelty, exaggerated by rumor, or politically motivated accusations, the stories gain a life of their own. Blood, whether literal or symbolic, becomes the language through which contemporaries explain the terror they feel in the presence of wealth, power, and mysterious behavior. As night falls over the castle, shadows deepen, and the air carries a chill that makes your skin prickle. You can almost hear the whispers of villagers, the clatter of unseen footsteps, and the imagined drip of blood in dark chambers. Erzsébet, living in this charged environment, becomes both observer and subject of legend. The interplay of isolation, power, and rumor ensures that the stories of the Blood Countess will outlive the reality, turning Chejde Castle into a stage for myth, fear, and fascination. By the end of her life at Chejde, Erzsébet is immortalized in stories that blur the line between historical fact and folklore. The blood legend, with all its horror and exaggeration, serves as a mirror reflecting the anxieties of the era: fear of female power, aristocratic privilege, and the unknown. And as you listen, standing in the imagined halls of her castle, you feel the delicate tension between truth and myth, an echo that will resonate for centuries. You trudge through the shadowed hallways of Chejde Castle once more, the air thick with candle smoke and whispered tension. Erzsébet Báthory, now in her 40s, faces a storm that no wealth, pedigree, or fortress can fully shield her from: legal investigation. Rumors that have festered for decades are finally reaching ears of authority, fueled by political enemies and aggrieved families. You can almost hear the echo of knocks at the door, the shuffle of papers, and the low murmur of interrogators as they prepare to extract confessions that may or may not reveal the truth. Mainstream historical fact. In 1610, Erzsébet is formally investigated by a commission led by György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, after complaints and reports of her alleged atrocities reach the royal court. The investigation is extensive, involving testimony from dozens of witnesses, including servants, neighbors, and members of her extended family. You can almost imagine the meticulous process: scribes recording every word, rooms full of trembling witnesses, and the heavy weight of legal authority pressing down on a woman accustomed to commanding rather than answering. Quirky tidbit: during the interrogations, some witnesses reportedly confessed under torture, leading to fantastical claims of blood rituals and secret chambers. One account mentions a servant describing hidden passageways that, according to other sources, simply didn't exist. You can almost see the exaggeration growing with every retelling, like a snowball rolling down a hill, each new layer adding more absurdity or horror. Historians still argue whether these confessions reflect genuine crimes or the distortion of fear and coercion. Did Erzsébet commit the acts she was accused of? Or were the testimonies the product of extreme duress, political maneuvering, and societal expectation? The debate continues, with evidence both sparse and contradictory. The interrogation process itself is revealing. Witnesses are often subjected to pressure, threats of imprisonment, and in some cases, physical coercion. In this environment, The line between truth and invention blurs. People report what they think authorities want to hear, or what will absolve themselves from scrutiny. You can almost feel the psychological strain, the way fear warps memory, and the way rumor hardens into evidence. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some testimonies describe bizarre punishments, including tales of blood drinking and elaborate torture devices. Yet other accounts from the same investigation mention only standard corporal punishment, estate discipline, or neglect of servants. You begin to sense how the fantastical elements of the legend may have been inserted, either intentionally or through repeated storytelling, to make Erzsébet's story more scandalous and memorable. Despite the chaos of testimonies, one detail remains consistent. Erzsébet's position of power gave her authority over many lives, and she exercised control that could be perceived as harsh, even brutal. Yet whether these actions rise to the level of systematic murder, as later legends claim, is impossible to verify. You can almost hear the whispered questions. Who benefits from these stories? Who stands to gain by amplifying fear of a powerful woman? Historians still argue about the reliability of the records. Some scholars suggest that the combination of political rivals, disgruntled servants, and general social instability created the perfect conditions for exaggerated accusations. Others insist that patterns of testimony, even if inconsistent, suggest at least some reality to claims of cruelty. You can feel the tension in the air, like walking a tightrope between documented fact and narrative construction. The psychological pressure of the investigation is another dimension. Erzsébet, accustomed to authority and control, now finds herself scrutinized, her every word and reaction observed. Isolation, stress, and the possibility of lifelong imprisonment weigh heavily. You can almost hear her thoughts, a mixture of indignation, calculation, and perhaps fear. How to maintain dignity while facing relentless accusation. How to protect herself when allies are few and witnesses are many. By the time the investigation concludes, Erzsébet is confined to her castle at Chete under house arrest. She will never stand trial in the conventional sense. Her estates are largely retained, and she continues to live in isolation until her death in 1614. The confessions, extracted under extreme duress, remain a cornerstone of the Blood Countess legend. Yet their reliability is deeply contested. You can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down on the interpretation. What is history and what is myth? In the end, Erzsébet's story at this stage is a crucible of perception, power, and rumor. The confessions under duress contribute to a narrative that has haunted Europe for centuries, blending fear, fascination, and political maneuvering. And as you trudge through the imagined corridors, you sense the fragility of truth in a world where authority, coercion, and imagination collide. You trudge through the echoing corridors of Chejte once again, and this time, the walls feel less like protection and more like silent witnesses to plotting. Erzsébet Báthory's life has become entwined with politics in ways that stretch far beyond her estates. While rumors of cruelty ripple through villages, the true danger comes from courts and courtiers, men and women who wield pens favors, and whispers with the same lethality as swords. You can almost hear the subtle tension in every handshake, the hidden agendas behind polite smiles, and the quiet strategies unfolding behind closed doors. Mainstream historical fact: Erzsébet's downfall is shaped in large part by enemies in the royal court and local nobility who view her power, independence, and the Bathory family's influence with suspicion. Feuds over land, resources, and political allegiance are constant. Her prominence, combined with the notoriety of the alleged blood crimes, makes her a prime target for adversaries eager to seize advantage. You can practically feel the eyes watching from every corner, every minor error magnified into scandal. Quirky tidbit: some nobles reportedly employed poets and pamphleteers to spread lurid tales about her, mixing gossip with morality plays. Imagine satirical verses circulating in nearby towns, dramatizing the Blood Countess in rhyming warnings that mothers would recite to children at bedtime. You can almost hear villagers chuckling nervously at the latest exaggeration, unsure whether to fear or marvel. Historians still argue to what extent these enemies orchestrated her infamy. Were the sensational stories of torture and blood rituals genuine observation, or were they inflated propaganda designed to discredit a powerful woman and her family? The debate continues, leaving a haze between political intrigue and legend. The tension between Erzsébet and her courtly adversaries is palpable. Nobles who covet her lands or resent her authority exploit rumors, stretching minor disciplinary acts into monstrous tales. You can almost see secret meetings in candlelit chambers, letters slipping under doors, and subtle threats hidden in polite invitations. Every glance is calculated, every conversation a potential trap. Quirky tidbit number 2. During her house arrest, it's said that some adversaries deliberately circulated counterfeit letters, allegedly written by Erzsébet, purporting to confess horrific crimes. These letters amplify fear, feeding the legend and ensuring that her reputation becomes inseparable from horror, whether or not the contents were real. You can almost picture scribes smirking as they inked exaggerated confessions. The castle, oblivious to the mischief outside. Political and religious tensions further complicate matters. Hungary at the time is a patchwork of Catholic and Protestant territories, Ottoman threats, and shifting alliances. Erzsébet's family is staunchly Catholic, which both protects and endangers her depending on which faction gains influence. You feel the stakes in every alliance, every negotiation, every minor quarrel. A careless remark could become a weapon in a power struggle that spans decades and borders. Historians still argue whether Erzsébet's enemies acted primarily out of greed, religious rivalry, or misogyny. Some suggest that the sensationalized tales of blood and cruelty were a convenient narrative for male nobles threatened by her independence and authority. Others contend that these rivals simply exploited an already unsettling reputation, amplifying it to destroy her socially and politically. In the thick of these dynamics, Erzsébet must navigate the impossible, preserving her estates, her dignity, and her life while under relentless scrutiny. Her intelligence, social acumen, and charisma allow her to survive longer than many would expect. You can almost feel the careful calculations behind every letter sent, every visitor received, and every action observed, as if she's playing a multi-dimensional chess game where one wrong move could topple centuries of accumulated power. And as night falls over Chejte, the castle becomes both a haven and a prison. Inside, Erzsébet manages her household with precision. Outside, courtly enemies manipulate the shadows, ensuring that rumor and fear are as potent as any armed threat. You can almost hear the whispered plotting, the soft clatter of ink on parchment, and the slow drip of time that measures both opportunity and peril. In this environment, her legend grows, part political casualty, part folk horror, part historical inevitability. By the time the legal proceedings begin, Erzsébet is already enmeshed in a web of intrigue spun by enemies who understand that perception can be as deadly as action. The stage is set for the final chapters of her life, where power, fear, and rumor collide in a spectacular, often horrifying narrative. And you realize, following her through the corridors of influence, that even a fortress as formidable as Chejte cannot shield one from the subtle weapons of politics and envy. You trudge through the winding corridors of Chejte Castle, the torchlight throwing long, jittering shadows across the cold stone, and you can almost feel the weight of official authority pressing down on Erzsébet. György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, has arrived, or rather, his investigators have, tasked with untangling the web of rumors, complaints, and alleged atrocities that have clung to her name like stubborn ivy. This isn't a casual visit. It is a meticulous, legalistic probe into every corner of her life, every action she has taken, and every servant under her authority. You can almost hear the clatter of quills, the rustle of papers, and the whispered anxieties of witnesses summoned to recount events that may have occurred decades earlier. Mainstream historical fact: György Thurzó is the chief royal official responsible for investigating Erzsébet in 1610. He leads a formal commission to assess accusations ranging from excessive punishment of servants to the alleged murder of young women. The process involves collecting testimonies from dozens of witnesses, inspecting estates, and documenting all findings meticulously. You can almost see Thurzó's team moving through the castle with notebooks, lanterns, and a sense of grim purpose. The air thick with anticipation and fear. Quirky tidbit: some accounts suggest that Thurzó, ever the cautious investigator, personally observed a young woman allegedly held in Erzsébet's employ, not to confirm horror, but to assess her health and condition. It is said that the girl appeared uninjured, raising questions about whether earlier reports were exaggerated or misremembered. Imagine Thurzó peering from behind a curtain, noting the minutiae of a single servant's demeanor, while Erzsébet observes with quiet calculation. Historians still argue how impartial Thurzó's investigation truly was. Was he motivated purely by justice, or did political pressures, personal ambition, and the influence of rivals shape the narrative he collected? Every document, every witness, every signature bears the potential bias of its context, and separating fact from interpretation is a challenge that has endured for centuries. The investigation itself is methodical. Witnesses are questioned under oath, and in some cases under duress, producing confessions that are part truth, part exaggeration, part survival tactic. You can almost hear the subtle hum of tension in the room as terrified servants recall memories, aware that their words may determine the fate of both themselves and their mistress. Each statement is scrutinized, compared, and catalogued. The castle transforms into a theater of inquiry, with Erzsébet both participant and observer. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some reports suggest that Thurzo employed what we might now call cross-examination with servants, asking the same question repeatedly over hours or even days to see if stories aligned. You can imagine the psychological strain, the confusion, and the tiny inconsistencies that could be blown up into damning evidence. It's like watching a chess game where the pawns are terrified humans, the queen is Erzsébet, and the king is the weight of the law itself. The stakes are immense. Hungary is politically unstable, the Ottoman threat looms, and noble families jockey constantly for advantage. Thurzo's findings could topple one of the region's most powerful families, or confirm a legend that has already gripped Europe's imagination. You feel the pressure in every action, the weight of centuries of gossip, fear, and ambition pressing down on a single commission. Historians still argue whether the commission's methodology was standard for the era or unusually biased. Some suggest that the use of forced or suggestive testimony skewed the results, inflating stories of cruelty into myths of systematic murder. Others contend that the sheer number of accounts, though contradictory, points to some underlying truth, even if distorted by human perception and political motivation. Erzsébet herself is caught in a delicate dance. Accustomed to wielding authority, she must now navigate a process where power is held by others, and rumor can become evidence. You can almost feel her observing every question, every reaction, calculating how to respond with dignity, deflect suspicion, or minimize damage. It is a situation that tests intellect, patience, and nerves, and the castle itself seems to pulse with the tension of this intrusion. By the end of Thurzo's inquiry, Erzsébet is placed under house arrest, confined to her castle, but spared public execution, a decision that satisfies political needs while containing scandal. The documentation, the testimonies, and the investigation itself become the foundation for the enduring legend of the Blood Countess. And you realize, wandering the imagined halls with her, that the figure of Thurzo, the investigator, the observer, the recorder, plays a crucial role in transforming rumor into enduring historical narrative. You trudge through the cold, silent corridors of the castle, the walls casting long, jagged shadows in the flickering torchlight. Something about the night seems different tonight, a tension in the air that doesn't belong to ordinary domestic routine. The castle is usually quiet at this hour, save for the occasional creak of floorboards or distant howl of a wolf in the forest. But tonight, you can almost feel the presence of outside forces pressing in, as though the world beyond the stone walls has decided to intrude. The night raid, as later chroniclers would call it, begins with whispers, creaks, and the soft footfalls of men who carry authority like a weapon. Mainstream historical fact. In December of 1610, Thurzo's men arrive at Szeged under the cover of night to apprehend Erzsébet Báthory. Acting on complaints and testimonies, the raid involves soldiers and officials entering the castle without warning, ensuring that the alleged crimes are interrupted and witnesses secured. You can almost hear the muffled commands, the clatter of boots on stone, and the anxious murmur of servants suddenly thrust into the heart of a legal and political maelstrom. Quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim that Erzsébet, anticipating some kind of intrusion, had her corridors illuminated with candles and her dogs positioned strategically, not necessarily to resist arrest, but to observe, record, and intimidate intruders. Imagine the servants peeking from behind doors, wide-eyed, as noble blood meets armed authority in an unplanned theater of suspense. The spectacle is almost cinematic in its tension, with torches casting erratic shadows over stone walls and tapestries. Historians still argue whether the night raid was conducted with complete procedural fairness, or whether political motives shaped its execution. Some suggest that Thurzo may have timed the intervention to prevent Erzsébet from influencing witnesses or destroying incriminating documents, while others speculate that the timing amplified fear, ensuring cooperation from servants and bystanders. The scene inside the castle is chaotic yet measured. Soldiers move quickly but quietly, sealing exits, checking rooms, and securing potential witnesses. You can almost hear the low murmurs of interrogation forming in the background. Questions asked in hushed tones, responses filtered through fear, every action documented meticulously. The castle, usually a sanctuary for Erzsébet's authority, is suddenly transformed into a stage where every shadow is suspect, every movement scrutinized. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some later accounts describe servants observing unusual behavior during the raid, candles flickering unnaturally, doors that seem to close on their own, or animals reacting strangely to the presence of armed men. While these could easily be embellishments, they add a sense of supernatural suspense that fuels the legend, blurring reality with myth. You can almost hear the distant howling of wolves, as if nature itself is responding to the tension within these walls. The night raid also demonstrates the delicate interplay between authority and fear. Erzsébet, who has spent decades wielding control, now experiences the inverse. She is subject to the will of others. You can sense the psychological dissonance as she observes officials meticulously documenting every corner of her domain, questioning every servant, and cataloging details of her daily routines. The tables are turned, and the castle, once a symbol of her absolute authority, becomes a cage of scrutiny. Historians still argue how much of the raid's depiction in pamphlets and chronicles was exaggerated. Were the dramatic details, guards confronting her personally, servants fainting in terror, doors slamming as if by magic, real observations, or embellishments designed to heighten the sense of drama and fear? The interplay between fact and sensationalism is evident, creating a narrative that will outlive the actual event. By dawn, the raid has succeeded. Erzsébet is apprehended, witnesses are secured, and the stage is set for her house arrest. The castle returns to an uneasy silence, but the atmosphere is permanently altered. The night raid becomes a pivotal moment, not just in legal terms, but in legend, transforming Chaged Castle into a symbol of both dread and fascination. You can almost feel the stone walls absorbing the tension, storing it for future generations who will read the tales and shiver at the idea of a night when authority, rumor, and fear converged under a single roof. Walking through these imagined corridors, you realize the raid is more than a military action. It is a turning point where legend begins to intertwine irreversibly with historical record. Fear, authority, and political necessity coalesce into a story that will haunt Central Europe for centuries. And you can almost feel the pulse of that night beating beneath the stones, echoing with every whispered retelling. You trudge through the imagined corridors of Chaged Castle once more. But this time, the castle feels strangely silent, as if holding its breath. Erzsébet Báthory is confined, her authority stripped, and the machinery of justice begins to turn without her active participation. The trial that will define her legacy is underway, but she is absent, observing, or perhaps imagining every motion from behind barred doors. You can almost hear the hushed murmurs in distant courtrooms, the scratch of quills, the deliberate pacing of officials who must navigate law, politics, and rumor, all while crafting a verdict that will echo through history. Mainstream historical fact. After Erzsébet's house arrest, Thurzo continues the investigation and legal proceedings, summoning witnesses to testify in her absence. This trial by deposition is unusual for the period, but reflects the influence, status, and logistical challenges of prosecuting a high-ranking noblewoman. Witnesses provide accounts of her alleged crimes, detailing punishments, disappearances, and stories that range from mundane discipline to supernatural horror. You can almost picture the room filled with scribes, recording each testimony meticulously, the tension palpable as every word carries weight. Quirky tidbit. Some testimonies describe implausible or theatrical claims, such as secret underground chambers, stocked with instruments of torture, or baths of blood capable of preserving youth. While these claims are likely exaggerated, they contribute to the mythos surrounding Erzsébet, transforming administrative actions and household discipline into tales of horror. You can almost see the servants describing events with wide-eyed terror, their accounts growing more dramatic with every retelling, like gossip amplified through a megaphone. Historians still argue whether the trial's proceedings can be trusted as accurate reflections of Erzsébet's behavior. Were the testimonies shaped by coercion, fear, and political motives? Or do they reveal an underlying pattern of cruelty? The lack of Erzsébet's direct defense complicates interpretation, leaving historians to debate the reliability and intent behind the evidence collected. The trial proceeds slowly, weaving together decades of alleged activity. Witnesses often recount events from memory, leading to inconsistencies and occasional contradictions. You can almost feel the tension in the air, as officials balance credibility, fear, and politics, crafting a narrative that both satisfies legal expectations and resonates with the scandalous legend already circulating in villages and courts alike. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some scribes included remarkably specific but unverifiable details in their reports, such as exact counts of servants allegedly harmed or fantastical descriptions of her supposed baths. These flourishes suggest that the trial record may serve as both documentation and entertainment, reflecting the cultural appetite for horror and moral lessons. You can almost imagine the clerks smirking at their own embellishments, knowing that future generations will read their words with fascination and dread. Despite Erzsébet's absence, the trial exerts immense influence over her fate. Every testimony, every sworn statement, every rumor folded into official record contributes to a growing legend that begins to overshadow her life's mundane realities. You can almost feel the weight of history pressing down, transforming personal misdeeds, if any, into archetypal tales of female power, fear, and corruption. Historians still argue about the consequences of trying Erzsébet without her active participation. Did this procedural choice protect her dignity? Or did it allow enemies to shape the narrative unchallenged? Some scholars suggest that absence made it easier to exaggerate, while others maintain that her eventual confinement and the consistency of certain testimonies support the credibility of the claims. In this phase, the castle becomes both stage and prison, while Erzsébet becomes a silent protagonist in a story she cannot fully control. Her life, actions, and reputation are distilled into words recorded by others, each phrase susceptible to exaggeration, misinterpretation, and political manipulation. You can almost hear the scratch of quills marking her legend as reality and myth weave together into the complex tapestry that will endure for centuries. By the end of the trial, Erzsébet is confined permanently, her estates partially managed by trustees, and her legacy sealed in a mix of legal judgment and folklore. The absence of her voice in these proceedings allows the narrative to take on a life of its own, merging fear, rumor, and fact into the enduring legend of the Blood Countess. And as you trudge through the empty, shadowed corridors of Chejte in imagination, you feel the echo of history and myth colliding, leaving a story that will fascinate and horrify for generations. You trudge through the imagined corridors of Chejte Castle, now quieter than ever, the air heavy with the knowledge that Erzsébet Báthory will never again move freely within these walls. House arrest has become permanent confinement, a fate both protective and punitive. She is not executed publicly, as was often customary for nobles accused of crimes, but instead bricked within a small section of the castle, sealed off from the larger world. You can almost hear the echo of the mason's hammers, the dust settling on stone, and the muffled footsteps of servants as they adjust to the presence of a silent, enclosed figure whose legend will only grow in the years to come. Mainstream historical fact: Erzsébet was confined to a set of rooms in Chejte Castle, effectively under house arrest, from 1610 until her death in 1614. She was sealed behind a walled section of the castle with minimal contact with the outside world, while guards and family members ensured she could neither escape nor exert influence. This unusual method of confinement was intended to prevent public scandal while still demonstrating royal authority. You can almost picture her small chamber, sparsely furnished, lit by a single window, where time stretches endlessly. Quirky tidbit. Some later accounts romanticize or dramatize her isolation, claiming she survived only on minimal rations and communicated with servants through small openings in the walls. While the historical record is sparse, the imagery of Erzsébet sitting quietly behind bricks, plotting, reflecting, or simply staring at the passing seasons feeds the mystique of the Blood Countess. You can almost feel the claustrophobic tension, the sense of being both trapped and observed simultaneously. Historians still argue about the psychological and symbolic intent behind this confinement. Was it primarily protective, intended to prevent her from being lynched or assassinated, or punitive, designed to emphasize her fall from power and reinforce the moral narrative surrounding her alleged crimes? The wall itself becomes both literal prison and metaphorical statement, and its interpretation shapes centuries of legend. Life in this enclosed space is marked by monotony and isolation. Erzsébet has little opportunity for social contact, entertainment, or meaningful activity beyond observing the small garden visible from her window or conversing quietly with trusted attendants. You can almost hear the soft rustle of clothing, the gentle murmur of conversations carried through walls, and the relentless tick of time echoing through the confined chambers. Quirky tidbit number 2. Legends claim that during her confinement, Erzsébet maintained some rituals of grooming, perhaps bathing, and dressing carefully to retain a semblance of dignity. While partly speculative, these acts symbolize her continued assertion of identity and authority even when physically restricted. Imagine her reflection in a small mirror, arranging her hair, clothing, or even small objects around her room, a quiet act of defiance and preservation. The bricked walls serve multiple functions. Practically, they secure her physically. Symbolically, they mark her transition from active noblewoman to figure of legend. Every visitor, every guard, and every report of her condition reinforces the perception of her as simultaneously dangerous, mysterious, and larger than life. You can almost feel the tension radiating from those bricks, containing a story that cannot be fully known, only imagined. Historians still argue whether this method of confinement influenced the later mythos of the Blood Countess. Did the extreme seclusion, combined with sensationalized reports, allow imaginations to fill in the gaps with horror and intrigue? Was the walled-in section a practical solution to political sensitivity, or a narrative device amplified by storytellers and chroniclers? The ambiguity ensures that both fear and fascination endure. In her final years, Erzsébet's experience becomes a meditation on isolation, power, and perception. She's alive, yet removed from society, observing the world she once commanded through a narrow lens. The castle, silent and shadowed, becomes a container for legend, a physical embodiment of the line between life and myth. You can almost sense her awareness of the stories swirling beyond the walls, of how rumor and fear have begun to shape her enduring image. By the time she dies in 1614, the walls have done their work. They have preserved the life, constrained influence, and inadvertently contributed to legend. Bricked within the castle, Erzsébet becomes both historical figure and mythic icon, a symbol of fear, power, and the enduring fascination with cruelty and mystery. And as you imagine walking the silent halls around her confined chamber, you feel the echo of centuries of stories, each brick a witness to a life transformed into legend. You trudge through the imagined streets of early 17th century Hungary, leaving the stone walls of Chejte behind for a moment, and step into a world where ink and rumor wield more power than swords. Erzsébet Báthory's name has already begun to echo beyond the castle, and now it spreads faster and wider through pamphlets, broadsheets, and the grapevine of the literate and curious. You can almost feel the rustle of freshly printed pages, the scent of ink and paper, and the nervous excitement of townsfolk as they exchange the latest sensational accounts of the so-called Blood Countess. It's a world where fear is commodified, and legend becomes a form of currency, mainstream historical fact. By the early 1610s, numerous pamphlets circulated in Central Europe, describing Erzsébet's alleged crimes in lurid detail. These publications reached audiences far beyond her immediate sphere, including neighboring kingdoms and regions, and helped solidify her reputation as a figure of horror. The pamphlets often mixed fact with exaggeration, and their wide distribution ensures that rumors become accepted knowledge in public consciousness. You can almost hear the crackle of conversation in village taverns and market squares as people read aloud the tales, exchanging wide-eyed horror and nervous laughter. Quirky tidbit: some pamphlets included fantastical illustrations showing Erzsébet in an exaggerated Gothic pose, sometimes holding goblets of blood or surrounded by ghostly victims. While clearly artistic interpretation, these images reinforced the textual narrative and played into popular fascination with horror and the macabre. You can almost see a child peeking at a page, the grotesque illustration leaving a lasting impression far more vivid than any sober account of a state discipline. Historians still argue how much of this pamphlet culture reflects genuine observation versus intentional propaganda. Were these documents primarily aimed at exposing criminal acts, or were they tools to vilify a powerful woman in a male-dominated aristocracy? The interplay of gender, politics, and rumor complicates every claim, leaving modern scholars to sift truth from sensationalism. Pamphlets often thrive on the dramatic. Witness accounts are presented with hyperbolic language, repetitive emphasis, and theatrical structure. Imagine a storyteller reading aloud in the town square. The Countess, whose heart knows no mercy, bathes in the lifeblood of the innocent. Even if the event never occurred, the phrasing lodges itself in memory, like a catchy tune you can't forget. The language transforms fear into a spectacle, ensuring that Erzsébet's reputation grows exponentially with every retelling. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some pamphlets included warnings directed specifically at young women. advising them to avoid the lands around Sejte or risk being drawn into her web of cruelty. These moralistic flourishes appeal to societal anxieties about female virtue, obedience, and the dangers of interacting with nobility. You can almost hear anxious mothers reading these aloud to their children, blending cautionary advice with a taste of dark entertainment. The production and circulation of these pamphlets also reflect broader European trends. During this era, print technology and increasing literacy allow information, true, false, or somewhere in between, to spread rapidly. Tales of witches, monsters, and criminals thrive in this environment, and Erzsébet's alleged deeds fit perfectly into a genre already popular among readers craving thrills and moral lessons. You can almost feel the market energy. Printers competing to outdo each other with ever more shocking accounts, while readers eagerly consume each new horror story. Historians still argue whether the pamphlets had a direct impact on Erzsébet's fate or were mainly posthumous amplifications. Some scholars suggest that printed materials played a role in shaping the perception of her crimes during the investigation and afterward, while others believe that oral rumor networks were equally, if not more, influential. Either way, the effect is undeniable. Erzsébet's story becomes larger than life, a legend codified in ink and paper. The phenomenon of pamphlet propaganda demonstrates how fear and fascination can transform a historical figure into myth. You can almost feel the tension between reality and imagination as you trace the spread of these documents, watching ordinary accounts of a state discipline and strict oversight mutate into narratives of supernatural cruelty. Each page, each rumor, each exaggerated story contributes to a legend that will endure far beyond Erzsébet's lifetime. By the end of this period, Erzsébet Báthory exists not only in the stone halls of Chejte, but also in the imaginations of countless readers. Her image amplified, distorted, and immortalized. Pamphlets and printed stories become the vectors by which history and legend merge, ensuring that the Blood Countess will haunt Central Europe and the pages of history for centuries. And as you imagine picking up one of these pamphlets, you feel the thrill, fear, and fascination that made her story irresistible, a legend that print alone could not contain. You trudge through the valleys and villages surrounding Sejte Castle, feeling the mist cling to your skin and hearing the faint whisper of the wind through pine and oak. By now, Erzsébet Báthory is no longer just a woman of noble blood, no longer merely a feared matriarch of the Bathory clan. She is something else entirely. In the imaginations of the people, in the whispered conversations in taverns, in the pamphlets circulating through distant towns, she has begun to transform into a creature of the night, a vampire, a symbol of insatiable hunger and eternal youth. You can almost see the villagers casting furtive glances at their windows, imagining shadowed figures and mysterious disappearances. And you feel the eerie thrill of a legend evolving before your eyes. Mainstream historical fact. The tales of Erzsébet bathing in blood to preserve her youth, first recorded during the investigation, gradually seep into folklore and literary accounts, linking her with vampire-like characteristics, while no contemporary sources describe her literally as a vampire. The imagery of blood drinking, nocturnal rituals, and supernatural vitality feeds directly into Central European vampire lore. You can almost sense the cultural atmosphere, where superstition, fear of the aristocracy, and fascination with the macabre intertwine, creating fertile ground for myth-making. Quirky tidbit: some later stories suggest that Erzsébet could charm or hypnotize her victims, a trait often associated with folkloric vampires. Villagers reportedly spoke of her unnaturally alluring presence, her beauty preserved beyond normal aging, and a gaze that could mesmerize. Imagine overhearing these whispered accounts in a candlelit tavern, each retelling more dramatic than the last, blurring the line between rumor, fear, and the imagination of the storytellers. Historians still argue whether the vampire association is merely symbolic exaggeration or an early example of folklore shaping the memory of historical figures. Did Erzsébet's actual behavior inspire vampire legends? Or were tales of vampires retroactively grafted onto her story to make sense of her notoriety? Either way, the transformation from countess to mythic creature illustrates the power of storytelling and cultural imagination. The vampire narrative gains traction partly because of pre-existing regional beliefs. Transylvania, Hungary, and surrounding areas are rife with superstitions about undead spirits, witches, and blood-drinking monsters. When reports of Erzsébet's cruelty and obsession with youth emerge, villagers and storytellers interpret these events through the lens of local mythology. You can almost hear the overlapping narratives, warnings about witches, stories of revenants, and tales of blood-sucking demons merging into a single, terrifying figure. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some pamphlets exaggerate the number of victims into the hundreds, describing secret nocturnal hunts and elaborate rituals. While these claims are likely inflated or fabricated, they reinforce the vampire imagery, combining horror, aristocratic fear, and fascination with immortality. You can almost picture the illustrations: dark castles, pale countesses, and shadowy figures writhing in candlelight, a scene that would later inspire Gothic literature centuries afterward. The vampire image also reflects societal anxieties. A powerful, independent woman exercising control over her household, wealth, and destiny becomes transformed into a supernatural predator in the popular imagination. You can almost feel the cultural tension: fear of female authority, fascination with beauty and youth, and dread of unseen, uncontrollable forces, all crystallize into the figure of Erzsébet as vampire. Her alleged acts of cruelty serve as a metaphorical vehicle for these anxieties, amplified by myth. Historians still argue about the role of literature and oral tradition in cementing the vampire connection. While there is no evidence Erzsébet ever claimed supernatural powers or engaged in literal vampirism, the amalgamation of rumor, political propaganda, and folkloric motifs ensures that she enters the collective imagination as a monstrous, almost otherworldly figure. You can sense how folklore fills gaps left by history, transforming partial truths into enduring legend. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, Erzsébet's image is inseparable from the vampire archetype. Writers, storytellers, and folklorists adopt her as a template for tales of bloodthirsty female vampires, linking historical rumor to Gothic horror. You can almost hear the echoes in literature centuries later, from Bram Stoker to modern reinterpretations, where the figure of a beautiful, powerful, and terrifying woman continues to captivate. And as you wander through the foggy hills of the Carpathians in your imagination, you feel the thrill of legend taking root. Erzsébet Báthory is no longer merely a historical figure. She is the embodiment of fear, fascination, and the human tendency to transform truth into myth. The Countess has crossed the threshold into vampire lore. Her story forever entwined with the shadowy allure of the night. You trudge through the archives of history, the imagined scent of old parchment and ink filling your senses, and you realize that Erzsébet Báthory's story is not just a tale of cruelty. It is a puzzle of perception, bias, and interpretation. For centuries, she has been cast as a monstrous villain, a blood-drinking countess who defied every boundary of decency and morality. But the deeper you dig, the more you notice cracks in the narrative, subtle hints that perhaps history has not told the full story. You can almost hear the rustle of historian notes, the careful sorting of evidence, and the quiet debates in lecture halls over what truly happened behind the walls of Chait Castle. Mainstream historical fact. Modern scholarship has revisited court records, witness testimonies, and property inventories, revealing a mixture of fact, exaggeration, and political maneuvering. While Erzsébet was undoubtedly a strict and sometimes harsh landowner, the extreme claims of hundreds of murders, secret torture chambers, and bloodbaths are not conclusively supported by contemporary evidence. You can almost picture historians hunched over manuscripts, cross-referencing letters and official documents, trying to disentangle rumor from reality. Quirky tidbit. Some researchers suggest that Erzsébet's fascination with hygiene, beauty, and herbal remedies, common for noble women of her time, may have been twisted into the legend of blood bathing. What was once a pursuit of youth and wellness is recast as ritualized cruelty in the retelling. You can almost imagine a perfumed Erzsébet in her chambers, mixing potions and lotions, unaware that these innocuous acts will centuries later morph into horrific imagery. Historians still argue whether Erzsébet was truly guilty of the violent acts attributed to her, or whether she was a victim of political fabrication. Some scholars emphasize the role of her family's rivals and the gender dynamics of early modern nobility, suggesting that a powerful woman was easier to vilify than a man with comparable influence. The debate is ongoing, reflecting the difficulty of reconstructing past lives from incomplete and biased records. The reassessment of Erzsébet's story also considers the legal context of her time. Servants' testimonies were often obtained under duress, sometimes involving torture, and legal standards for evidence were vastly different from today's. You can almost hear the sighs of jurists past and present, acknowledging how the combination of coercion, rumor, and political pressure could produce confessions that satisfied authority while obscuring the truth. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some historians note that Erzsébet's estates were highly organized and economically successful, a fact often overlooked in sensational accounts. She managed her household with precision, maintained her lands effectively, and navigated a complex web of noble alliances. You can almost see the ledgers and inventories neatly kept, a stark contrast to the chaos implied in legends of horror. Historical reconsideration also shines a light on gender bias. Erzsébet's independence, authority, and refusal to conform to expected female submissiveness may have made her an easy target for slander. You can almost feel the tension of her position, a woman wielding power in a patriarchal society, with every misstep amplified and every rumor weaponized. Her legend, in part, reflects societal anxieties as much as it does alleged actions. Historians still argue about the consequences of centuries of myth-making. Did the legend obscure real crimes, exaggerate minor acts, or completely fabricate events? Some suggest a blend. Erzsébet may have disciplined servants harshly, but political enemies, cultural anxieties, and sensationalized pamphlets transformed these actions into stories of systematic murder. You can almost sense the interplay of fact, exaggeration, and imagination, creating a narrative that is both captivating and misleading. This reevaluation does not entirely erase her fearsome reputation, it merely complicates it. Erzsébet becomes simultaneously a figure of power, a potential criminal, and a symbol of societal fears about authority and female agency. You can almost feel the tension between fascination and skepticism as history and legend continue to dance together, making it difficult to separate one from the other. By the time modern scholarship examines the case, Erzsébet Báthory is no longer simply a blood countess. She's a lens through which to study early modern justice, political intrigue, and the formation of myth. And as you trudge through the stacks of evidence and stories, you realize that the true power of her tale lies not just in horror, but in the way human perception, rumor, and narrative shape history itself. You trudge through the imagined halls of power in early 17th century Hungary, the air thick with the weight of patriarchal expectation and political hierarchy. Erzsébet Báthory's story is inseparable from the environment in which she lived, a world where women of power were rare, scrutinized, and often mistrusted. Every decision she makes, every action she takes, is filtered through societal expectations, magnifying scrutiny and magnifying rumor. You can almost feel the eyes of nobles, servants, and neighbors watching her, judging her, interpreting her behavior according to standards designed to constrain female authority. Mainstream historical fact: Erzsébet Báthory, as a noblewoman managing vast estates, wielded significant economic and political power. She oversaw hundreds of servants, maintained strategic alliances through marriage and family, and navigated complex relationships with both Hungarian and Habsburg authorities. Yet her gender made her vulnerable to censure in ways her male counterparts might not have experienced. You can almost sense the double bind. Assertive governance is admirable in men, but suspect or dangerous in women, leaving Erzsébet vulnerable to criticism and rumor. Quirky tidbit. Some contemporary accounts hint that Erzsébet's penchant for strict household rules and her insistence on discipline were interpreted as unnatural or excessive simply because she was a woman. Imagine a servant nervously tiptoeing around her chambers, aware that the same behavior from a male noble would have drawn little attention, while Erzsébet's assertiveness becomes fodder for scandal and fear. Historians still argue about the extent to which gender shaped her infamy. Was she targeted because of alleged cruelty, or because a powerful, independent woman disrupted societal norms? Some scholars contend that misogyny amplified minor transgressions into sensational narratives, while others maintain that documented evidence of her actions justifies the legends of horror. The debate underscores the challenge of separating social prejudice from objective analysis. The intersection of gender and authority also appears in legal proceedings. House arrest, bricked confinement, and the reliance on witness testimony all highlight the precarious position of a woman accused of wrongdoing in a male-dominated hierarchy. You can almost hear the whispered judgments of court officials. A woman cannot wield such power without consequences, as if legality and morality are inseparable from gendered expectation. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some reports suggest that Erzsébet's appearance, grooming habits, and public demeanor were scrutinized alongside her alleged crimes. Beauty, charm, and youth, traits often admired in noble women, were sometimes cited as tools of manipulation or seduction in testimonies, further entwining gender with accusations. You can almost see her adjusting her hair or clothing, aware that every gesture could be misinterpreted as evidence of scheming or danger. Gender also influenced rumor and propaganda. Pamphlets portraying her as a bloodthirsty predator often emphasized her femininity, transforming domestic discipline into alleged seduction, torture, or supernatural cruelty. You can almost picture illustrators exaggerating curves, gestures, or expressions, blending physicality with horror to make her seem both alluring and terrifying, a combination that would become a staple in vampire and Gothic lore. Historians still argue whether Erzsébet's portrayal as monstrous reflects genuine criminal behavior or culturally conditioned fear of female authority. Some suggest that her legend exemplifies early modern anxieties about women who defy passive domestic roles, while others see her case as unique due to the scale of her wealth, influence, and the political stakes involved. Either way, her gender is inseparable from how history remembers her. The dynamic of gender and authority also informs modern reinterpretations. Erzsébet becomes a case study in how societal expectations shape the memory of women in power, demonstrating how rumors, bias, and legend can amplify scrutiny. You can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing on her story, as historians, feminists, and folklorists dissect the interplay between power, perception, and prejudice. By the end of this reflection, Erzsébet Báthory emerges as more than a symbol of horror. She embodies the tension between female authority and patriarchal fear, illustrating how gendered expectations can magnify reputation, influence, and myth. And as you trudge through these imagined halls, you feel the resonance of her story, not just in terror and legend, but in the subtle, enduring lessons about power, gender, and perception. You trudge through the misty hills and dense forests surrounding Chete and other Bathory estates, the ground damp beneath your feet, and the scent of pine resin and cold stone filling the air. The castles themselves loom like silent sentinels, their towers and battlements half shrouded in fog. Long after Erzsébet's death, the stones seem to hum with residual energy, a combination of history, fear, and imagination. Locals whisper about shadows moving in windows, footsteps echoing in empty halls, and rooms that retain the echoes of past lives. You can almost feel the chill of unseen presence, a mixture of legend and architecture that ensures the story of the Blood Countess lingers far beyond the written page. Mainstream historical fact. Many castles associated with Erzsébet Báthory, including Chete, have long been in ruins or partially preserved, attracting tourists, historians, and paranormal enthusiasts. Reports of ghost sightings, unexplained sounds, and eerie experiences are common, though typically anecdotal, contributing to the enduring fascination with her life and legend. You can almost hear the creak of old beams, the rattle of loose shutters, and the whisper of wind through cracked masonry, all lending the sense of a living history. Quirky tidbit: some guides and local storytellers claim that Chete Castle is haunted specifically by Erzsébet herself, wandering the halls at night, brushing her hair, or gazing from the windows. While there is no empirical evidence for these hauntings, the narratives persist, and you can almost see her spectral figure moving gracefully through corridors, simultaneously terrifying and mesmerizing any visitor daring enough to stay after dark. Historians still argue about the origins and significance of these ghost stories. Are they simply the natural product of crumbling architecture and imagination, or do they reflect cultural memory, a way for communities to process fear, trauma, and historical events? Some suggest that the legends serve as cautionary tales, blending moral instruction with entertainment, while others see them as a continuation of the myth-making process that began during Erzsébet's lifetime. The architecture itself seems complicit in creating a haunted atmosphere. Narrow staircases, high towers, hidden chambers, and echoing halls all contribute to the sensation of presence. You can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down on your shoulders as you imagine navigating these spaces, knowing that each corner and shadow could hide stories or specters of the past. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some paranormal enthusiasts report cold spots, sudden drafts, or inexplicable noises in Chete Castle, which are often attributed to Erzsébet's restless spirit. Whether interpreted as spiritual residue or natural phenomena, these accounts feed the narrative of the haunted castle and amplify its appeal in popular culture. You can almost hear your own heartbeat, matching the rhythm of the old stone walls. A blend of fear, curiosity, and historical awe. The haunted castle motif also reinforces the link between Erzsébet's legend and Gothic imagination. Writers, filmmakers, and artists have drawn inspiration from the ruins and their spectral associations, transforming real historical spaces into evocative symbols of horror, power, and mystery. You can almost see the fog-drenched towers and twisted staircases appearing in novels, movies, and paintings, each echoing the eerie tales that began centuries earlier. Historians still argue whether the haunted reputation is a product of genuine historical memory or modern romanticization. Some maintain that locals' accounts may be rooted in authentic oral traditions, while others suggest that tourism, Gothic fiction, and popular culture have retroactively amplified the sense of fear. Either way, the castles continue to serve as physical and symbolic anchors for Erzsébet's enduring presence in collective imagination. Walking these halls in thought, you feel the intersection of history and myth. The stones remember power, authority, fear, and rumor, while the imagination fills in gaps with ghostly narratives. You can almost feel Erzsébet's legend lingering in the air, her influence extending beyond life into a space where architecture, rumor, and memory create a timeless sense of haunted presence. By the end of this journey, the castles themselves become characters in the story, witnesses to the passage of time, and vessels for legend. You can almost hear the faint laughter or sighs of the past, echoing through empty rooms, ensuring that the story of Erzsébet Báthory, the real woman, and the mythic figure remains alive, haunting, and impossible to forget. You trudge through the landscapes of modern imagination, the mountains, forests, and ruined castles, now serving as backdrops for stories that stretch far beyond Hungary. Erzsébet Báthory has transcended history and folklore to become a cultural icon. Her image reproduced in literature, film, video games, and art across centuries. You can almost feel the pulse of her legend vibrating through creative works, from Gothic novels to horror cinema, anime, and even heavy metal album covers. The Countess exists simultaneously as historical figure, vampire archetype, and symbol of fear, power, and transgression. Mainstream historical fact: Erzsébet Báthory's life and alleged crimes have inspired countless adaptations, beginning with pamphlets in the 17th century and continuing through contemporary media. Writers, filmmakers, and artists have drawn upon her story for horror narratives, psychological thrillers, and explorations of female authority and cruelty. You can almost see her name scrolling across book covers, movie credits, and game character biographies, cementing her place in the cultural imagination. Quirky tidbit: in some modern adaptations, Erzsébet is reimagined not as a villain, but as a complex anti-hero, or even a sympathetic figure, reflecting contemporary fascination with morally ambiguous characters. You can almost picture her as a brooding, stylish figure in a graphic novel, a vampire with both menace and allure, appealing to audiences who enjoy the interplay of beauty, danger, and intelligence. Historians still argue about the balance between historical accuracy and creative license in her portrayal. Do portrayals that emphasize bloodbaths, supernatural powers, or psychological terror obscure the reality of her life? Or do they serve as a form of cultural storytelling that preserves essential truths about fear, power, and myth? The tension between fact and fiction ensures that her story remains endlessly fascinating. The Countess's image has also been shaped by gendered interpretations. As a woman of extraordinary power, she challenges social norms, and her legend reflects anxiety surrounding female agency. You can almost sense the interplay between empowerment and demonization. She is celebrated for cunning, charisma, and intelligence, yet simultaneously feared and condemned for stepping outside prescribed boundaries. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some subcultures embrace Erzsébet as a symbol of empowerment or rebellion, using her image in fashion, cosplay, and fan art. Her name adorns everything from perfumes to jewelry, demonstrating how a historical figure, once vilified, can become a versatile symbol in contemporary culture. You can almost hear the whispers of fans debating whether she was murderer or misunderstood noblewoman, and whether those debates themselves are part of her continuing legend. Cultural transmission ensures that the legend evolves with each generation. Erzsébet Báthory becomes a lens through which creators explore horror, beauty, immortality, and moral complexity. You can almost feel her presence in a darkened theater, a graphic novel page, or a streaming video. Her story reinterpreted, yet instantly recognizable. A bridge between history and imagination. Historians still argue about the ethical implications of transforming a real person into a mythic figure. Does the amplification of horror overshadow historical context? Or does it allow deeper engagement with societal fears and archetypes? The conversation itself highlights the dynamic relationship between history, legend, and culture, illustrating how narratives adapt and survive. By the end of this reflection, Erzsébet Báthory is no longer confined to stone walls or sensationalist pamphlets. She exists in minds, on screens, and in pages worldwide, a symbol of power, transgression, and enduring fascination. And as you trudge through these imagined landscapes, you feel the full force of her cultural legacy, a life, a legend, and an icon that refuses to be forgotten, bridging centuries with the dark allure of mystery and imagination. The candlelight flickers low, and the imagined winds of the Carpathians whisper faintly outside. You've walked the shadowed corridors of shadowy, traced the contours of legend, and glimpsed the complex figure of Erzsébet Báthory, not just the blood countess of myth, but a noblewoman whose life, choices, and surroundings created fertile ground for stories that would outlive her. You can almost feel the centuries pressing down, the echo of quills scratching, pamphlets rustling, and whispered tales growing louder with every telling. What you've experienced tonight is more than horror. It's a meditation on history, memory, and how the human imagination transforms reality into myth. Erzsébet's story reminds us that power, especially female power in a patriarchal world, can be feared, exaggerated, or even vilified. Legends grow in the shadow of authority, rumors take root in fear, and pamphlets, whispers, and folklore become vessels through which people negotiate morality, justice, and curiosity. You can almost hear the clash between the real and the imagined, the whispers of skeptics, and the gasps of generations captivated by her story. Yet even amidst darkness, there's fascination, a strange beauty in the narrative's endurance. You can almost feel her legend alive in literature, art, and modern media, proof that stories once told take on a life of their own, reshaping themselves for every new audience. And as you sit back, letting the imagined corridors fade, the fog lift, and the candle burn low, you realize you've walked both history and myth, seen fear and power intertwined, and glimpsed the shadows that shape our cultural imagination. So now, you drift toward rest, carrying with you not just the story of a countess, but the realization that legends are mirrors, reflecting societal anxieties, human fascination, and the blurred line between truth and narrative. In these moments, you understand why some stories, like Erzsébet's, refuse to die. They linger in our minds, shaping nightmares, fascination, and curiosity alike. Sweet dreams.